Hello, welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon, and this is Chewy. Today we're going to look at a game between Robert James Fischer and Bent Larson from 1958. This is a Sicilian Dragon. It's a beautiful game. It's actually very relevant to the theory of the dragon today, and also lots of beautiful tactics, and a really good lesson on how to attack a fianchetto king. So let's take a look. Fischer is white, e4. c5 from Larson, knight f3, so it's a standard open Sicilian. Knight f6, knight c3. So this g6 move characterizes the dragon, which is a fascinating variation, produces some of the most tactically complex games in all of chess. It's sound. I think some people would say it's less sound than the Najdorf, whatever that means. It's certainly more risky than the Najdorf, but it's a great line for both sides. Bishop e3 from white, so this is perhaps signalling intention to enter the Yugoslav attack, which is the sharpest variation of the dragon. Fischer makes the point that knight g4 here loses a piece, because bishop b5 check. You put the bishop in the way, the bishop's pinned, put the knight on d7, the knight drops off, put the knight on c6, you can take it with the knight. So this is not good. Black doesn't fall for that, plays bishop g7. Pawn f3 by white, so reinforcing the e4 pawn and stopping knight g4. Black castles, so really pretty harmonious development from black. Queen d2, signalling the intention to castle queenside and also setting up this battery, perhaps placing the bishop on h6 to swap off that powerful dragon bishop, perhaps advancing the h pawn to open the h file and create an attack. Knight c6, again very natural. So Fischer makes the point here that bishop c4 stops d5, but actually it's completely correct to castle. Then black can play d5, and you get into these sort of lines. Takes, knight takes on c6, and then bishop on d4. This, I think, is the main line after long castle by white, and this is not incorrect. But Fischer's preference is to not allow d5 and play bishop c4. This is interesting theoretically. So Larson's taking on d4 here. Now the standard move is most commonly played move is bishop d7. But funnily enough, Stockfish at a very, very deep level, Stockfish supports taking on d4. So Larson actually, this was quite a theoretical innovation, and I would encourage you to try this in your own games actually, because it's a pretty good line for black. Although white wins, it's a pretty good line for black. So white takes back, and then black can play bishop e6, which would not have been possible with a knight on d4, because white can take twice on e6. White backs up. Queen a5, you often see this from black in the dragon. It's an aggressive posting for the queen. Long castles from white. Now Fischer makes the point that after black takes here, white can take back, and this pawn structure is very hard for black to break through, and the engines agree with this. The engines don't like the idea of black taking on b3. But black's got this move, advancing the pawn. White puts the king on a safer square. As Fischer says, you never know when lightning might strike. Black pushes again, attacking the knight, which jumps into d5. And then what happened was Larson took here with the bishop. Fischer makes the point that taking with the knight would be a mistake, because this allows takes, then takes here, and after rook d e1, white builds up a lot of pressure on that e file. So Larson takes with the bishop, which is exactly right. Fischer takes back with the bishop, but Fischer says you could have taken actually with the e pawn, and again creating this pressure on the e file, like this. Now actually the engines score this as roughly equal, but Fischer mentions a Tal game in which Tal won, and clearly what this really is just a different plan. The plan is basically pressure against that pawn, which is on a semi-open file, and it's very hard to advance that pawn because you've got the d pawn and the bishop on b3 that are ready to take it, and the rook. So this is more of a kind of positional pressure concept, and clearly you're getting to an endgame here. But Fischer chose not to take with the pawn, took with the bishop instead. And Larson played rook ac8. Now, Fischer made the point that after knight d5, it's looking really, really drawish, which suggests this is a good line for black. I mean, if black can get a draw, particularly against a player like Fischer, then black's had a good day, right? I mean, of course, we all want to win, but Fischer knows what he's doing. So, for instance, a line might go, you pick up the bishop here, there's a knight check. My instinct would be to bring the bishop back and take it. So you get this sort of exchange here. White has an extra pawn, but you can't make any use of it whatsoever. If you didn't bring the bishop back, if you took with the pawn here, it's quite pretty actually. Rook goes there. So now we're going to try to keep the bishop, bring the bishop back here, but then black can attack it twice when it's pinned. So again, you get to a position that's pretty level. So actually, if Larson had have taken the bishop here, I mean, we're heading for a draw. But he chose not to. And what that says to me, actually, and the engines back this up, is it says the line's actually sound for black. So Larson played rook ec8, apparently told Fischer he was playing for a win. Fischer then removed that powerful bishop, and that bishop comes in very handy. I mean, that bishop's very powerful, hitting the f-pawn and also pinning it. So, for instance, the f-pawn can't take back if white were to take the g-pawn, for instance. Larson then goes to double, and Fischer just starts this attack down the h-file. Larson's moving the queen out of the way, basically to start advancing the a-pawn, and also makes the point that you couldn't have done that straight away on this move because the pawn would have dropped, the a7 pawn drops. That's why the rook has to go to c7 to defend the a7 pawn. h4 from white, queen, and then white just pushes on. So black has some choices here. What if the knight takes the pawn? Looks very natural. Then white's taking here. g4 is pretty uncomfortable for the knight. There's a check here, king runs, and then g5. This is very common, very thematic. Knight can come here, otherwise you've got a horrible mate on h7. White just exchange sacrifices there and then pushes. g6, the f-pawn can't take. The h-pawn takes, the queen takes, but of course again the f-pawn can't take, check, and then the check down there is the end of days. So knight can't really take after h5. What if the pawn takes? Well, example variation g4. Black takes it, white takes back, black takes this pawn. You've now got the queen hitting h7, which is threatening mate in 1. The knight can stop it, but then the bishop takes on g7, and then you've got a rook fork, forking the queen and the knight. Black can block the rook fork, but there's a check on h6. The rook takes there with check. This is pretty grim. And that's mate. So there's lots and lots of attacking ideas here. So once you're playing h5, it's a real crisis. So black decides to leave it there, not move the knight or the pawn, just double on this file, which is clearly a useful move. And if it wasn't for the bishop on b3, that pawn on c2 would be looking really embarrassed. So white's taken. Black has to take with the h-pawn. The f-pawn is pinned, as we know. g4, very natural for white. It's the natural way to progress the attack. Black has his own plans. Pawn a5, threatening to trap that bishop, but it's one move too late. g5, the knight skips to h5, white, and I think this is where Fine made the quote, which is on the front page. In such positions, combinations are as natural as a baby's smile. White just chops that knight off, exchange sacrifice, and then pushes the pawn. Again, the pawn on f7 is pinned. e5, I mean, it's not a bad move. It's starting to look a bit like desperation because white's taken here with check. You know, but white's sacked in exchange, so it's not over. King to f8. You can't... Well, you could take with the rook, but black's chosen not to. White's bishop's coming around, so you're thinking about bishop h6 pretty soon, and certainly the black king looks, you know, pretty exposed. This is a good move by black, pushes. So the bishop can't take this, because then black does take here and actually gains equality. And now the pawn on f7 is undefended because the black pawn's blocking it. So white pawn takes. The rook chops this off, but now white has this push. That advanced pawn looks threatening and also takes away a lot of squares from the king, takes away e7. Clearly we're attacking the rook on f7. Rook moves. Bishop attacks it. Queen comes back to b7. So now basically Larson's sort of, I would imagine, he's a good player. He's pretty much resigned to his fate. He's given an exchange back, but I think this is just sort of desperate defending to avoid checkmates. I mean, let's look at a variation that Fischer gives. Fischer gives this, and then this queen move is very difficult. It's threatening mate on g8 because the pawn's taken away the e7 square. The queen goes in the way. You can take there, and that's taken away a bunch of material. For instance, if the queen takes on d5, the bishop can go to e7 with check, and white's at least a piece up. But you know, white's also got a beautiful advanced pawn. So black's gone here instead. White takes the exchange back, pushes the pawn. The rook goes in the way. And I think Fischer makes the point that this is a mistake because there's a mate in 3. It's quite a hard one to see. This way, check. King there, check. Bishop in the way, check. Mate in 3. How do we know it's mate in 3? What if the bishop goes in the way? Can we work this out? So if the bishop goes in the way, I assume that queen d6 looks horrendous, doesn't it? It's the end. Queen d6 is the end. It's really pretty, isn't it? So actually that bishop on g7 gets in the way. So I thought it was a fantastic game. I mean, one of the things actually worth pointing out, one of the things that Fischer says is, could black have impeded the attack? So here, after h4, is there h5? Now, experienced players will naturally see here the idea of pawn g4. I think particularly when the black light square bishop is missing, pawn g4. So, for instance, if takes, then it's natural for white to push. What should we take, with the knight or the pawn? We're only going to show one example. Let's take with the knight. Knight takes. So we're going to swap these bishops off. Then we're going to take here, the knight's attacked. Knight runs, queen here, check. Queen at the back, mate. So the point is, it's really, really hard. So the knight took. If the pawn had taken, we take here. Let's take an example. Let's imagine the knight takes on this square. Queen moves out of the way because it's attacked and also attacks the knight. Let's say the knight goes back. We take this pawn. Black plays e5, desperately trying to block the bishop out, but we can just push this pawn, and this pawn, this is the end of days. Because, I mean, for instance, a rook on the g-file would cause enormous problems here, but this is too much to bear. I mean, what does the engine say here? The engine says best for black is knight d5. And actually, this is engines for you, look. It would take here. And so, if we took here, rook d g1 is checkmate. That's kind of really unstoppable. I mean, the only way to stop it is putting the knight in the way, which isn't much use, is it? So, pretty stuff. So, I thought that was a really, really good game. I think, actually, it's fascinating that Larson's move, this knight takes d4 move, is still, theoretically, ever so relevant today, although it's not the most commonly played move. And I actually think we see something a bit similar going on in the Maroczy bind at the moment. Similar idea about black making an early exchange on d4 before white can retreat to c2. So this was a cute game, and I'm going to try it as black sometime. I've actually got a club match this week, so if you're my opponent, book up, because if I'm black, I might just try it. Alright, look after yourselves. We're all well. Chewy's well. Say goodbye, Chewy. There he is. Can you see him? And I've not got no food for him today. I hope you're all well. See you soon.